Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming today. This is our webinar on our paper that we wrote a few months ago by the Wildlife Conservation Hub, part of the Global Collab Network. And it's about the ripple impacts of poaching on the world. So I'm really glad that all of you guys are here. And I guess we can get started with some introductions now. Okay.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Sarah Bigley. I am one of the co-ambassadors for the Wildlife Conservation Hub. I am from Herndon, Virginia, and some of my scientific interests are evolutionary biology or genetics, and I'm also an environmental advocate.
Awesome. And my name is Ankita Vengaswamy. I'm from Los Angeles, California. I'm a co-ambassador to this hub. I'm also an ecologist and an aspiring botanist. I love advocating for endangered species and orphaned animals in particular. And I also love the beach and playing soccer.
Hi, I'm Danielle Reed. I am the Hub's social media liaison. I'm from Milton, Georgia, and I'm aspiring zoologist and environmental scientist. I am also a polo player, and I enjoy all things outdoors and nature.
Okay, awesome. So if you're interested, we have our paper right here, so you can scan the QR code and look at that if you want. We're also going to be presenting on it right now, so feel free to just listen to our presentation and maybe check out the paper afterwards. Yeah. Right, and then this is our pear deck. So for this webinar, we're doing something a little different. We're actually having it kind of be more interactive. So we set up something called Pear Deck, and if you just go to that link that's on your screen and then enter that code, you'll be able to join the Pear Deck that we have in session right now. And in that, we'll be able to ask you guys questions and get your responses on a bunch of things that we'll be discussing. And then we can like share out everyone's responses after that. And I think it'll be pretty interactive with all of you guys. So we'll just give you like a minute or two to join that Pear Deck. And yes, let me put that link in the chat. That should be the link. And then just enter that code SYDVJY.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and move on, but if you still need the link or the code, just ask in the chat and everything you need to access it should be there. So for the first question we have for you guys, if you could type in the Pear Deck your response to this, what is poaching? So this can be anything you know about poaching, anything you've learned or even you think you know. We just kind of want to get a sense of where everyone is and maybe what some of your specific interests are for this. And so whenever we talk and have a little bit of like a Q&A discussion at the end, we can have it more geared towards what everyone's interested in. So I'll give you guys like 30 seconds maybe to just type out a few responses and then we'll move on. Okay, I know that was less than 30 seconds, and if you all are still typing, that's more than fine, but I'm just gonna go ahead and start explaining this a little bit more. So poaching is basically the illegal hunting or capturing of wild animals and plants. So this, whenever people think of poaching, they generally think of like rhinos in Africa or elephants or something like that, but it could be any animal or organism even that you're illegally taking away from its environment. So a lot of the causes of this include food security, trophy hunting, medicinal value, and ecotourism. And we'll talk about these and a few other ones in our presentation. And so why do you think poaching is such an issue and how is it affecting the world? If you could just type this in the Pear Deck really quickly, and then we can move on to the next slide. Okay, and Keitha, before we move on, do you want to just read out a few answers or some common themes?
Yeah, for sure. So some of the things you guys mentioned is because there's an economic incentive in many cases to poach, definitely it kills innocent animals which may already have been endangered, killing species and hurting economies, losing creatures illegally, killing off species and of animals and plants. It is an issue because it can endanger species and it has lasting effects on the organism's environment, aka the food chain. So these are all really great responses. And I think we can move on to our first effect of poaching. Yes, so let me just hide these responses. Okay, so we're just going to ask you, how could poaching cause zoonotic disease spread? So this, if you don't know what zoonotic disease spread is, it's basically any disease that has been spread from an animal to a human. In fact, COVID-19 that we're in right now, it has been spread from animals to humans. So just type your responses in this Pear Deck and I'll give you a minute or two to do that. And then I'll read some of these out. So I'll start reading some of these. Exposing animals with illnesses to others, bringing new disease to human populations, unsanitary spread. Without being sanitary or having exposure to animals that have diseases, it could easily be transmitted to humans and passed on from there. Animals who have a disease may not be known to those who are hunting. When a person hunts and consumes the animal, that animal's disease possibly transmits. So these are all very true. So we're going to talk a little bit about how poaching can cause zoonotic disease spread. So before that, I think the main three things that contribute to zoonotic disease spread or contributing factors are the zoonotic pool, which means the diversity of wildlife microbes in that area. So just thinking about what animals, what species are in the area and what things are already being passed around within that species can contribute to zoonotic disease spread. Pathogens in wildlife, especially environmental change causing more prevalence of pathogens in wildlife. And of course, like many of you mentioned, direct human and animal contact, whether that's through bites or saliva exchange, organs and tissues, urine, feces, or any bodily fluids. So about infection and disease spread. Overhunting and bushmeat trade increases the risk of human-animal contact. Like I mentioned, a few ways of that happening would be bites, saliva, urine, feces, bodily fluids. And exposure to these bodily fluids is a common agent of disease spread. And here we have a few different diseases that in the past have been caused by zoonotic disease spread. Some of them are COVID-19, Ebola, HIV-1 and 2, anthrax, salmonellosis, and simian foamy virus. So what actually happens is poaching can also eliminate higher level herbivores in animals, which causes there to be a smaller animal population, such as rodents. And animals like rodents are effective disease spreaders. So other than just like directly coming into contact with animals and catching diseases from them, indirectly poaching also causes some spreader animals to become more prevalent, and they're able to spread the disease faster. In one study in Cameroon, they associated road building and logging with the spread of HIV/AIDS, monkeypox, Ebola, and Marburg virus, which is historically been very prevalent in Cameroon. And they were able to see that taking down animals' forests and areas of living directly impacted them and allowed them to spread viruses to humans, and also populations of animals that are known to be spreaders were also able to thrive in these conditions. So another question for you, who do you think zoonotic disease spreads usually affect? Meaning what types of people? So let me just add a text box here. for you to respond. And I'll give you like a minute or two here. So I'll start reading some of these out loud then. Anyone, however, people who already have health problems will suffer the most, definitely. Poachers, absolutely. Direct exposure, health of those eating the meat, families of direct exposure, all supply chain constituents. Little ones and older adults are likely at risk, at higher risk due to lesser immune systems. Yeah, so these are all great responses. Particularly, I like the response about families of direct exposure and health of those eating the meat. So let's move on here. The people who are most impacted by zoonotic disease spread are usually the localized communities who live near these, where poachers are poaching and destroying the habitats. So I like the answer with, the people who are eating the meat, because oftentimes these localized communities are relying on the bushmeat trade as food security. And when these animals are poached or when they have disease in them, or when they're over hunting for their bushmeat trade, they are directly eating the animals that have diseases, and oftentimes those diseases spread to these localized communities, and then they spread around these communities. But the most impacted areas in a study from 2021 was mostly Ethiopia, Tanzania, Nigeria, and India. These were the most common places where zoonotic diseases affected the people. But it is spreading to many other places. As you know, through COVID-19, it became, from something that was like a localized community, it became, a global pandemic. So with more poaching, you're just going to see more and more disease spread globally. And another thing to consider with these localized communities is that they oftentimes have less resources for medical care. And since they are, binded by their food security to rely on the bushmeat trade, they aren't able to get treated as well. So this is just kind of a compounding effect for these localized communities, and is something that poaching only exacerbates. So now we'll be moving on to effects on species extinction and ecosystem. So I'll hand it over to Sarah to talk about this one.
Thank you. Okay, so the first part of this is species extinction. And for just some quick background before we jump in, bigger animals are going to be the ones that are at greater risk for this extinction. That's because they have longer reproductive cycles, just as a general rule here. They also have lower population densities because they're case selected, which means that the offspring are, they're very cared for by the parents, and kind of like contrasting that with like frogs or something, or I'm sure you guys have all seen Finding Nemo. There's like a million babies and like they expect a lot of them aren't going to make it. But with our case selected animals, then they really care for their babies, kind of like humans, to make sure that as many of them as possible can reach adulthood. Also, bigger animals, there's more like game sport and it's more exciting for the poachers. And so it seems like more of like a fun activity for those types of people. And that's also kind of like how they're more iconic with that. And the dwindling numbers, it increases the money gained from poaching, because the more animals or the less animals there are in a community, the more valuable the remaining ones become, which is kind of like this whole like poaching complex going on here. And then kind of going back to the case selected thing, the young depend on their parents more in these bigger animals. So another like little background thing here. So as for the percent of rhinos conserved in South Africa, 40% of Black rhinos are conserved, and 84% of white rhinos are conserved. but the average poaching rate is still 34%. And so this is from a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's government control and it's not, people aren't regulating it. Sometimes people just disobey the law or somehow secretly poach the rhinos. But what to take away from this slide is that even though there are efforts to reduce poaching, it's not always effective. So a few poaching statistics, and while I'm reading this off, start to think about which one shocks you the most. So starting with tigers, there's 3 subspecies of tigers that have already been declared extinct. These tigers are mostly, like, obviously they're not really in America so much, but zoos have done a lot of protection efforts to try to conserve these tigers, like the Siberian tiger I know is an example of one. And then elephants is our next one. In a specific national park in Africa, around 80% of the elephants have been poached. And that's a lot of elephants because in Africa, these national parks have a ton of elephants. And then our last one is the rhinos. So the poaching rates are actually increasing despite all the conservation efforts. And although it's very hard to track rhinos because usually they're tracked by their horns. And so since poachers usually take away their horns, it makes like conservation and tracking particularly difficult. But with that, a lot of them have been decreasing, even though governments have put in policies and different laws even to protect this. So if you haven't already, if you could quickly type into the Pear Deck something that shocks you the most, whether about these 3 animals, or if you've heard about any other animal poaching that also surprised you, you can go ahead and write that too. Okay, so if you're still typing, that's more than fine. You can go ahead and finish that up, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next part here. So some of the factors that go into the species extinction is that it can be really difficult to count the animals. Like I mentioned a minute ago, since the horns are often counted and they have the trackers in them to track the rhinos, as soon as those are taken away, it can make the numbers really messed up. Also, conservation is extremely hard to enforce, especially in Africa. Whenever there's so many different countries, there's lots of different governments going on, because unlike the US, it's not all under one government. Each individual country, for the most part, has its own like governmental system. And so that makes conservation extremely hard to enforce since everyone has different rules and there's different boundaries, which get messy with conservation and who's taking care of the animals there. There's also a lot of economic effects with poaching, which we'll talk about actually in a later section, as well as habitat fragmentation. And then just another important thing here is the young can't live without their parents. And so even though like baby animals mostly aren't poached, without their parents, they won't be able to survive either, which also causes their numbers to fall. And so some people argue that that's a false number just because the babies aren't actually getting poached, but they're still getting affected by it, which is why we included it with the poaching effects. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this, and I think you guys also understand this from either history class or just other environmental studies. But how successful do you think animal conservation techniques are, and how can they be enforced? And with this enforcement, what role does the government play? So you can answer all these questions, some of them bullet points, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then Ankifa, if you want to read out some of the some good answers there, that would be great.
Okay. These are all really great responses, so I'll start reading some of them. Give people an alternative revenue source so that they aren't enticed to want to poach. The government can enforce these techniques. Wow, I would like to think the government would guide the effort in other countries. They do work. Gray wolf, bald eagle, manatees, maybe. Need greater funding for enforcement and bigger penalties for poaching. Governments need to work hand in hand with private sectors actors collaboratively. They can be successful, but at times they don't because of poachers being able to get away without consequences. They can be enforced more by having more government funding for conservation efforts. Governments have to set strict regulations and make environmental harm such as poaching a serious offense. This way, people will begin to take the issues more seriously. Governments have a lot of power to be able to protect the environment, but many don't utilize this power. It seems that most conservation efforts are not very effective. I think most efforts should be enforced by the people and not the government, because to be honest, the government's top priority is not saving animals. Seeing citizens enforce policies may get others more passionate and motivated to help out. I think these were all really great answers.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really, really great. I love the way you guys are thinking, and I like the people response too, because I think it's important to remember that even though the government might have rules, at the end of the day, it's up to the people to decide which ones they're going to follow. So that's a really great point. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Danny for our next section here.
Okay, so these are the effects on habitat fragmentation and resource depletion. So in the Pear Deck, you can put in what is biodiversity, what do you know about it, all that. And then Ankitha, read out some answers, please.
Okay, awesome. I'll start reading some of these out. Biodiversity is the different habitats that living organisms live in. Any living thing on the earth, so plants and animals. The diversity of different species in the same habitat or ecosystem. Biodiversity is the variety of animals in an ecosystem. Different types of life in a certain place. All the life in the ecosystem combined. The ecosystem of species. The more you have, the more healthy the environment.
Yeah, that's right. So terrestrial biodiversity, one of its top threats is habitat fragmentation. And one of the most common habitat fragmentation practices is road building. So road building causes mass habitat loss. Small animals are separated because of the road, and that causes their habitats to be reduced, and that lowers the diversity. Large animals are attracted to the road where they are then poached. It's almost like white-tailed deer on the side of a road here. Materials used to build the roads cause deforestation and erosion of the land, and so does urban development. So one of the most directly impacted places is tropical forests, mostly because there's no regulation and it's just excessive uncontrolled hunting and poaching, and their habitat is being destroyed at an alarming rate. And in Ghana, there was a study where 8 species were studied, and these species saw a 32 to 88% decline in their population because of human interference. One species that is really impacted is African elephants. There are 2 subspecies, but African elephants in general, their habitat is just being depleted. And they are coming to an increased contact with domesticated livestock and human beings. So their habitat is being small. So that decreases the genetic diversity, and that causes gene complications and harmful mutations to them. So in the Pear Deck, tell us what resource depletion is.
Okay, so I'll read some of these out loud. The decline of necessary materials for a certain thing, when all the needed resources to survive are threatened over time, loss of habitat, etc., the depletion of natural resources used by animals to live, all the resources that animals and plants depend on are depleted, impacting their livelihood and health, when resources are used faster than they can be replenished, the depletion of natural resources mainly caused by human intake.
Okay, so in the context of wildlife or poaching, it's when organisms such as fruit, trees, and animals are used or killed at a faster rate than they can reproduce, going back to the gestation period of larger animals that are being poached. So poaching is one of the most serious causes of resource depletion. Another one is deforestation, because forests are vital to humans and animals for their survival, and that causes a depletion of habitat for animals and oxygen for people and both animals. And then extinction of species. So species are taken for the illegal wildlife trade. They're being poached by poor families to make them money. They are also used for medicinal purposes, which isn't, they don't have medicinal value. It's thought in some cultures that they do, but rhino horns are just keratin, which is the same thing as your hair or the same thing as your fingernails. So it really has no purpose. Trophy hunting, that's another thing. So they use it for profit. And when animals are overpoached, plant species actually become depleted because they then move on to taking plant species. The last thing is a false economy causes people to think that they will make money forever off of poaching, but they won't, because once the wildlife is overpoached, there's no more animals for you to poach to make money off of. So it really is a false economy. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah.
Okay, so the next effect we're talking about is how it affects the local communities and also both the local and international economy. So as far as local communities, it's mostly in parts of Africa because that's where poaching is it's most common over there. And so one of the main causes here is the bushmeat is depleted for trophy or for resources, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But bushmeat is basically just unprocessed meat from animals, and it can also cause a lot of disease spread, as we talked about near the beginning. Additionally, this bushmeat can lead to malnutrition and poverty because of people are eating these. And then there's also going to be the economic impacts associated with that. So this is just like a little visual diagram here of how bushmeat is depleted. So over here on the left, we have whenever it's used for trophy. And so whenever you use the bushmeat for trophy, that's whenever you're going to be displaying it or selling it internationally. And this is going to be the main cause of money here. And then for the resources, it can also be sold internationally, or it can be used internally. And so with the international part, kind of think about the impressive things like the ivory from the elephants or the rhino horns or something that might be unique to an area. And then that's going to lead to big profit, which is the economic value in this part. And then as far as resources go, usually whenever it's like in Africa, since they are still a developing nation, a lot of the animal parts can be used for survival. So they can use that for a variety of things, sometimes for food or just using the different parts for different necessary supplies. So in the pear deck, if you could just say, does any of this surprise you? Maybe you already know it, or maybe it's something new. And if anything surprises you, what part specifically? So I'll give you like 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So as far as depletion goes, some of the effects we have here is migration. And so without the necessary resources, many people have to leave. So if there's not enough rhinos and enough wildlife in a certain area, people are going to have to leave because we rely on wildlife for so many things. And this can also cause overpopulation in nearby areas. And so if you think about if all the resources in one area are depleted, then you're going to have to move to another area. And then you're going to deplete the resources there and the organisms there and all the other things you need there. And it basically just keeps going because we're not stopping the chain of resource depletion. And so it basically just keeps transitioning into new ecosystems. The other option is you can settle for other meats. And this is specifically talking about the Africa effects here. And so with having different meats, people might need new tools. A lot of these wild meat sources are not very safe because there's lots of contamination. And so that's a really big issue with disease spread. It also eliminates other species, which damages the natural ecosystem. And then there's still going to be continued poverty and malnutrition because the economic impacts are really severe in these developing nations. So economic issues, this is just like a really quick overview of everything. Local communities, the bushmeat availability is the main issue. And then healthcare, this is looking at more global scale, malnutrition specifically in Africa, and then disease spread all over the world. Also the tourism aspect. A lot of people go to Africa and these countries for safaris or for some type of wildlife touring vacation. And so since there's less animals, less people are likely to travel there, which really hurts the economy since they depend on that, the tourism sales so much. And then there's this thing called the allele theory, which is poaching leads to more rare animals, which increases the value of them because there's less. And so this is kind of a bad example, but if you think of supply and demand, as the demand goes, as the supply goes down, then the demand goes up. And so it's kind of like that basic economic principle. The fifth is extinction, which is, of course, it's expensive to conserve these species, and so people aren't motivated to do that. And then the last one's the government, which we mentioned before. The governments don't have a lot of funds in many cases or a lot of political authority, and so it makes it really difficult to manage wildlife issues. So this is just a quote here. It says, economic desperation drives wildlife destruction, like poaching or illegal logging. And so thinking about this, can you type into the Pear Deck a few ways that we can provide environmental incentives, or I'm sorry, economic incentives to mitigate wildlife conservation issues? And so this is like a little bit of an action thing to think about. And even though us mostly as teenagers or as people not in political positions, it can be really difficult to think about what can be done. But it's always good to think about the effects we can have because everything that we do to educate people or to help still makes a difference. So I'll give like 2 minutes and then, Ankita, if you want to maybe read out 2 or 3 answers from this, and then we can move on to the next effect. Okay, so hopefully you all had a few minutes to think about some economic incentives. So Ankita, what are a few that people said?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just read a few of these. You can donate to wildlife foundations or organizations. You could also write to a representative. Employ poachers to patrol and make sure they have means to survive without poaching. That's a big one, I think. Mitigating wildlife conservation issues traces back to reducing poverty, which is why economic incentives are so important. Providing people with job opportunities and giving stimulus to pay for basic necessities reduces the need to resort to poaching and other forms of wildlife destruction. Provoke an emotion when educating people on these topics. Also utilize psychological ways to get people to think deeper about the topic. Also petitions, Gen Z is really big on that. Provide people with things like job opportunities. This will reduce the need for poaching. Land grants. So all of these were really great answers. I think in particular, providing people with job opportunities as well as providing basic necessities and making sure they're taken care of so that they don't have to resort to poaching is a big thing. Because, as I think one of us will talk about later, it is kind of something that people resort to because they think it's lucrative right away, and because it's more it's faster money than having like a stable job in many cases, and jobs are hard to come by a lot of the time. So providing more opportunities for employment is a big thing, and making sure people are taken care of so that they don't have to resort to this is also another big thing. So yeah, now I will be talking about the effects on animal social relationships, behavior, and fitness. So I think the main thing for this one is that animals that are poached, it's not just the animal that is poached that is affected. It's all of the animals that are left behind, such as their offspring, their predators, their prey, everything in their ecosystem, all of the animals around them are also affected. And Sarah touched upon this a little bit earlier, but the animals that are offspring of the animals that are poached are also considered casualties of poaching, just because the figure doesn't accurately depict that, because the animal is still technically alive, but as we're going to see, they aren't exactly normally functioning a lot of the time, and so they can be considered like casualties of poaching even if they aren't the ones directly being poached by poachers. So this picture is a picture of me, actually. I went to South Africa to work at an orphanage, at a rhino orphanage, where the rhinos' mothers had been poached. So I'm just, I just put a few pictures of myself in here. But to talk about orphan animals, some of the effects that they, endure throughout their lifetime is that after their mothers or their maternal presents are poached, either killed or, debilitated, they have a harder time forming successful social bonds and being integrated into social groups. They also have decreased life expectancy, stunted vocal behavior, less fitness and physical condition, and especially malnutrition without their mother's milk. So at rhino orphanages, a lot of the times the rhinos that came in were orphan animals that were very young, most of the times less than a year old, and they were still relying on their mother's milk. And so, at the orphanage, they actually had to create a new formula of milk for these rhinos to be able to, get the same nutrients that they would otherwise have gotten had their mothers not been poached and killed. And I think another misconception is that when poachers poach rhino horns in particular, there is a safe way to cut off their horns where it will grow back. But oftentimes poachers don't take the necessary precautions, obviously, because they're trying to get in and out and do it in secrecy. So they end up cutting their nasal canals off. And that's actually what leads to the mothers oftentimes dying from the poaching. So to continue this about orphaned animals, they oftentimes display something called compensatory bonding, which is relying on non-related animals of the same species because their maternal presence isn't there for them. In a study of orphan elephants from Samburu, northern Kenya, compensatory bonding was especially displayed, and the elephants were less likely to associate with mature adults and maternal figures, instead turning to their peers and other animals of the same species that weren't directly related to them. In a study on guanacos in Argentina, it was also found that orphan animals were likely to travel in smaller groups or even alone oftentimes. And this is also exhibited in rhinos in South Africa as well. And obviously this type of displaying this behavior is not, evolutionary beneficial. Staying together in groups of animals is oftentimes what keeps the animals alive and at less of a threat from poaching. So when they travel by themselves or in smaller groups of animals that aren't as mature, they stand an even more risk to poaching. And because of this compensatory bonding, orphan animals oftentimes have a hard time finding other mates to reproduce with, just because without a maternal presence, they aren't able to, develop their social behavior as much as they normally would do so at that age. And so another aspect of orphan animals that, poaching kind of impacts is their fitness and their space restrictions, especially their stress levels. So it's been found in animals' fitness that their stress levels are higher than normal animals that have a maternal presence. They have higher cortisol levels in their blood and excretion. They have hormonal changes, display aggressiveness, as I mentioned before, less success reproducing, and generally have a negative association with humans. So oftentimes animals that whose mothers have been poached are very distrusting of humans, rightfully so. At the orphanage that I volunteered at last summer, the orphan animals oftentimes took months to kind of warm up to the rangers on site. Even when they were providing milk and taking care of them, it was really hard to trust humans after such a traumatic event. Specifically space restrictions, animals that are confined to smaller spaces also have more stress. And as Danny talked about before, space restriction isn't just, taking an animal out of its habitat by poaching it, but it also is, habitat fragmentation, road building, logging. All of those things are kind of dividing up the area that an animal has to live in. And because of those man-made boundaries, they undergo a lot more stress. Just because they don't have enough room to kind of grow up comfortably. And then in these smaller spaces, there is a smaller gene pool, which causes there to be less biodiversity. And like I said before, they have a hard time reproducing with these space restrictions. And it kind of just compounds this effect, makes it harder for the species to survive. So even when one animal is poached from their habitat, it kind of it has a ripple impact on like all of the other animals around it, and all of the habitat they were living in. So now I will hand it over to Danny to talk about the effect on security and criminalization.
Yes, so the effects on security and criminalization. Okay, so in the Pear Deck, tell us if this is true or false. Terrorist groups are involved with poaching. Okay, so if you said yes, you're right. Sarah, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so terrorist groups actually benefit from poaching. Ivory funds them, which is crazy, but there's lots of terrorist groups in Africa, and there's regional conflicts between them. So those regional conflicts in Africa leave room for groups to ally with Al-Qaeda, causing a global threat. So it's not just poaching, it's a global threat. And then the other thing is criminal syndicates use a hierarchical system to keep leaders from punishment. So they have somebody that goes and they poach the animal, somebody that exports the horn, somebody that sells it, but the leader is never held accountable. And they just use organized crime to carry this out. So Sarah, can you tell us how we can help with poaching?
Yes. So we put a lot of information all out there at you guys. And I know it's kind of depressing, honestly, in a way to hear about all these issues going on around the world. And I know being a teenager myself, it can be really frustrating to think that I may not have a really big impact because I live in Virginia. There's not, rhinos here for me to go and conserve. But the most important thing to remember is that there's always something that you can do no matter what your age is, where you live, no matter what's going on, you can always make a difference. So the first thing you can do is educate people, which is what we're doing right now. You can teach your friends, your family, whoever is important to you in your life about the issues with poaching and animal conservation. Also, volunteering is a great way to help. I know not everyone can travel to a rhino sanctuary like Ankita did, which is awesome. But even if you can't help out with rhinos, volunteer at an animal shelter or do beekeeping. I know our hub has actually had a beekeeping campaign over the summer. You can also do like environmental cleanups to help protect animals, especially in the ocean. The third one is to donate. I know some of you guys said that for some of the economic mitigation techniques is donation, and that is a really great way to do it. One of our partners is an organization called Rhino Savers, and that's a great organization to donate to, but there's also hundreds more organizations that have similar missions. Fourth is to just care for the earth. Just do your part to conserve water, electricity, and waste, because our impacts also affect the animals. The fifth one is habitat. So whenever you go for a hike or a walk in your neighborhood, just make sure to stay on trails and not destroy habitat in the woods or the desert or wherever you live. And go out and visit your national parks. See if you can get involved there, educate yourself, just spend time in nature so you can fully appreciate the animals and what they do for us. And then the last one is joining our hub. We are always looking for new hub members. Our hub, we meet weekly on Sunday, but the time is very flexible. The commitment is also very flexible. We have a lot of fun projects, which we'll actually talk about now. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, so I skipped over this slide. So Danny, if you want to explain a little bit more about our hub and the collab in general, and then, yeah.
Okay, so we are the Wildlife Conservation Hub, and we are from the Global Collab Network, and our amazing founder, Linda, is here. So the Global Collab Network is a group of teen change makers, and we work on everything. So our hub works on wildlife conservation. There's one for climate, there's one for zero hunger, there's racial justice, there's all that stuff. And it's all based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So our hub specifically works with 14 and 15, which is life below water and life on land. So within that, we do a lot of projects. So in the past, we sold masks with our partner Rhino Savers in South Africa. We've done beekeeping in Arlington, Virginia. Our current projects, we're working on a podcast called Conservation Conversations. We have a social media campaign on our new social media accounts, and we are working on a collab book. And then in the future, we're looking to do some education outreach, like we're going to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival this summer. And then our awesome intern, Janae, is helping us do some marine conservation work. So if you want to get involved, I left the link tree in the chat, and you can join the hub through there.
Perfect. Thanks so much for explaining that. So now we're ready for questions. So if you all have any questions, I don't know if you can put them in the Pear Deck or if you want to type them in the chat in the Zoom room. Anything is fine. Or I don't know. I don't think you're allowed to turn on your mics. But just while you're thinking of questions, I'm just going to put this QR code up really quickly. This is the attendance form. So if you're here for service hours and if you want the credit, this is just to verify you were here. If you're interested in finding out more information about the collab and our organization and what our hub does, also go ahead and scan the QR code so we can get in contact with you. But if you're just here to learn or for fun, there's no need to unless you want to. So I'll have that up for a few more seconds here, and then any questions you have, we're ready to answer them.
So Linda asked in the chat, can you share more info about Rhino Savers? Absolutely. So Rhino Savers is a nonprofit organization based in South Africa, started by a man named Charles Summerfield and Tende Wilkinson from Uruguay. So their kind of mission is to conserve rhinos. Basically, they do that through a bunch of different ways. He's created songs. He's a talented musician, Charles, and the proceeds have gone towards rhino nonprofits, as well as he was actually one of the people who introduced me to the rhino sanctuary in South Africa, and he was a guiding presence for me there. And he generally just loves to support kids and educate others. He and Tendai go around to different classrooms and groups of students and present on why they should care about rhino conservation. And he has many resources as a musician, as a nonprofit leader. He's really amazing. And yeah, I think I can put the link to Rhino Savers in the chat here. But if either Sarah or Dan, you want to add any more, feel free to.
So Linda asked about starting SDG clubs in schools, and our first one is in Turkey. And I think that if you just go through the website, which is in the chat, you should be able to find more information there. And then also, is it helpful to share our social media? Where can we be found? On the next slide, yes, there's our handles, and our link tree is also in the chat, where we have all of our projects in there, and then we have our Instagram, our Twitter, our Facebook, and our podcast. It's all in there, and our section of the collab website is also on there.
And just to add on to the question before, sorry, about the SCG hubs, the clubs in the schools, I think our social media intern, Carolina, has created a guide for how to create an SDG hub or a club in your school. So if you're interested in that, that is on the website, like Danny mentioned. Okay, so let me just, okay, there's one more question on the Pear Deck. How do you think teens can get other teens to get interested in these subject matters and join clubs or organizations? So I think all of us can kind of speak to that, but I will go first. The way that I kind of get people in my life to care about conservation is just kind of asking them probing questions a lot of the times. Whenever there is something in the news or in media about wildlife conservation, a lot of people just like to skip over it, kind of brush it off. But for someone who cares about wildlife conservation, I hate seeing people do that. And instead, I like to discuss things when they come up. Whether it's, we have our Instagram campaign for Media Monday, Words of Wisdom Wednesdays, Fun Fact Fridays, just talking about it with people is just so impactful. Getting people to care is, I think, the first step. And then, getting them to join clubs and organizations. That's kind of what we hope to do here, is through kind of an in-depth exploration, we kind of give you an idea of what we do in the hub all the time. We talk about wildlife conservation every single weekend, thoroughly in depth, sort of similar to this. And I always come out of the meetings feeling really enlightened and, also bonded, because Sarah and Danny are like, some of the few people in my life who I can kind of openly talk to about wildlife conservation and not have to worry that they're like getting bored by me. So just kind of like forming that bond and, educating myself is kind of my incentive to join. But, everyone has a different reason why they care about wildlife conservation. So that's kind of what we hope to do. So if you guys want to add any more, feel free to.
Yeah, oh, okay. So my thing was, I grew up going to the zoo, and that really helped spark something. And then also watching the Irwin family, like that's their whole mission, is to get people involved in wildlife conservation, and just hearing them talk about animals, it just gets you so excited, to the point where like now I'm learning fun facts about animals, and I'll just like blurt out fun facts about like warthogs, and like I just have this genuine excitement about it that I feel like when I talk to people about it, it gets them excited too. So that's kind of where I come from with that.
I love that. And just to like add on to specifically teens, something I've really struggled with is I'm really passionate about wildlife conservation, but it's really hard to find people that will listen to what I have to say, just because of my, I'm a teenager, and like, what can I do about it? And so I would just say that if you can't find someone who listens to what you have to say about animal conservation or about anything in general, then go find someone else who will. And so instead of trying to get people who won't listen to us to listen, we're having this webinar for you all who are interested in these topics and who want to be here and who care about animals and want to spread the word. So I think that's just like a really important thing for all of you. So you all have the impact, and you have the ability to make a difference. And so, go do that, whether it's with animal conservation or whether you're more interested in racial justice or the climate or whatever you're interested in. Just make sure that you're using your resources and your voice for things that you care about, because there are always going to be people that are going to listen as long as you find them.
Yes, and then our last question is, Linda asked if teens can start their own projects in the hub, and absolutely. The first meeting I attended, they let me do my own social media campaign, which was amazing. And then I recently came to them with a wildlife images project, and I have some new projects coming their way too. So yes, you can absolutely come with your own ideas.
And just kind of because we're doing this webinar on our poaching paper, it was actually my idea, kind of with Sarah and Maria, who's our mentor, last year, to kind of even come up with this. I was like, I just want to know where's one place where I can go to find out how poaching can affect every single aspect of the world. And it was really difficult to find, but kind of talking about that project, it kind of gave life to that project as well. So that this paper was actually something that, was a passion project of mine, or something that I wanted to pursue. So absolutely, you can definitely start your own projects in the hub, and we'll always be willing to hear you out.
Absolutely. And it is 8 o'clock now, so we do want to be respectful of your time. So we just have one quick quote to finish up with.
Yes, so Paul Oxton, who is the founder and CEO of Wild Heart Wildlife Foundation, said, "No one in the world needs a rhino horn but a rhino," which we think is really true.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you everyone so much for coming. We really appreciate your time, and we hope you learned something, or at least had fun here today. If anyone has any remaining questions, feel free to stick around and we can help answer them. But other than that, that's all we have for you. So thank you.
These people are trying to leave. They don't know how. So this is my grandma and my mom.
Okay.
Grandma
Hello?
can't figure out how to leave.
Okay, so you stopped the recording.